Okay, one kind of not simple but common way of talking about change in sociology is to make a distinction between what we call exogenous and endogenous change. Now, we've actually seen these categories kind of lurking in the background in our course. What exogenous change means is that there's something outside of a particular system or a particular cultural pattern or something that comes in and causes change to happen. Now, a classic example of this is, of course, Marx's vision, which is he said, all right, up here we have this thing, this superstructure thing, which we talked about as kind of ideology is one of the words we use to describe it. And his whole argument that it was stuff happening down here in the base, so it was changes in market behavior, changes in the way production in factories was generated, huge changes in industrial capacity. It was stuff outside of the system of ideology that drove or caused the creation of these of this particular, oops, I don't want to draw arrows up there, of this particular cultural formation. So his big claim was to overturn Hegel. Remember, he flipped Hegel on his head, Hegel who was looking through a camera obscura. And Hegel actually was an example a little bit more of endogenous change, which is that there was ideology was really this kind of expression of what he termed Geist, which is a German word for kind of spirit of the age. And so that there was actually something endogenous, there was something internal to the system of thinking about the world that could develop as history moved forward throughout time. And part of the challenge of humans, in Hegel's term, was to become aware of that Geist. So to realize that it's already there, to be able to name it and describe it better, but that it was within the system itself that change was happening. So Marx and Hegel were opposed on this vision, and so not surprisingly end up on kind of two different sides of this exogenous endogenous thing. So let me try and diagram it one other way to make sure you understand it. But so a classic way of looking at this would be in kind of statistical language. We talk about dependent variables, or we label these Y if you've had statistics classes in any sort of field. And we usually talk about independent variables, which we label as X causing Y. Let me draw this more correctly for the language we're using here. So there's this thing out here, this X. So say, for example, corporate incomes causing political inequality. Or in Marx's sense, change in the base causing a certain ideological system. In an endogenous system, the relations between independent and dependent variables is much more complex. As a matter of fact, things are getting exciting here. As a matter of fact, not only are they not unidirectional, so it's bidirectional, go back and forth on each other, but we really almost can't even use the language of independent variable and dependent variable because they're interacting with each other. There's no sense that one is outside doing something to another. Let me see if I can see some more examples. One interesting example on this from our reading is if we think back to the rock and roll example. There is a possibility that the emergence of rock and roll was at some level endogenous, in the sense of that musicians were doing their own thing and being distinctive against other musicians. So one of the things we learned in that article was that there really was this presence of this whole other type of musical reality that wasn't being played on the radio. And these musicians, people like blues musicians or gospel musicians or country musicians, were producing distinctive music. So within the system of musical production, there was some endogenous relationship such that musicians were distinguishing themselves against each other. And this should very much bring up a lot of what we've learned about Pierre Bourdieu and about cultural systems being a lot about kind of distinction and positions, right? But one of the main things in that article that was very interesting was that it listed all sorts of exogenous things. So things like technological change, things like laws, things like market structure. So it really introduced us to the fact that there can be this whole range of forces outside a system that causes change. And while the article mostly focused on the exogenous things as causing rock and roll to develop in 1955, there were certainly endogenous processes going in as well. What we see here is that in our readings in particular, we see that the more difficult as well as complex path is to come up with what we would call a multi-causal path. So in other words, we want to see how both of these processes, both exogenous as well as endogenous processes, are occurring at the same time. So we get to Robert Wuthnow's article, which upon rereading it, I realize is like the equivalent of the difference between like organic wheat bread and white bread. That's really meaty. There's a lot of density to this organic wheat bread of Robert Wuthnow's article. It's actually based off of a terrific book he wrote, a very provocative book, by which he wants to describe sociologically how did major cultural changes in the way we think about the world happen. And he takes three of them. He says, I want to look at the Protestant Reformation, I want to look at the Enlightenment, and I want to look at socialism, really 19th century socialist thought, and say, where the heck did these systems of thinking and behaving and interacting come from? And these are huge changes because unlike in a history class, where we can sometimes feel as if there's some sort of natural development, that these things are always bound to happen, Wuthnow, as a sociologist, says, well, these big changes didn't have to happen, so therefore we can try to explain why they did happen. And he goes through and in a pretty interesting way brings together both exogenous as well as endogenous processes. So exogenous, he looks at this thing, what he calls environmental conditions. That's a nice phrase for exogenous. And he lists things like, for example, before the Protestant Reformation, trade had exploded in Central Europe, and there was this rise of this new class of businessmen alongside nobility, and they were jostling for position, so there's political intrigue. During the Enlightenment, there was already a split between religious and earthly authority, and so you have these different funding streams for people who want to think about and write about the world. The money didn't all just come from the church anymore. It could also come from this independent sphere of rulers. And in the lead up to socialism, there was mass impoverishment from the Industrial Revolution, as well as political ferment in the late 1700s. So he's saying that there's these environmental conditions that kind of set the stage for big ideological changes to happen. And when I say ideological, I don't mean it in the pejorative Marxist sense, but I mean it in the sense of whole ways of thinking about reality that we are born into. So he's saying that the environmental conditions really laid the groundwork for these things to happen. And then he looks at endogenous reasons. Now he doesn't really use this language, but it's there. It's there. And what he sees is, for example, in the Protestant Reformation, there was this whole explosion in scholarship happening within the Catholic Church, where people are looking at different ways to worship or different ways to read the Bible. It wasn't an anti-Catholic movement. Instead, it was a movement about making the religious tradition better. Now, it eventually became anti-Catholic, the Reformation, the split, but he's saying that there was this endogenous process already occurring within the Catholicism of that moment. And then, given the environmental conditions, boom, we end up with the Reformation instead of just a reform within the Catholic Church. We end up with this split. During the Enlightenment, endogenous, there were lots of people doing investigations about reality into different topics. So people are going out and inventing, telescopes and microscopes and writing books about watching the leaves and looking at the oceans and writing poetry. So you had all these kind of new genres of thinking about the world occurring that when put in with environmental conditions that I'd mentioned a little bit earlier, cause this whole new way of thinking about the world. And the same thing for socialism. So he goes and kind of traces how both of these things are occurring, and kind of ends up with the maybe not too shocking conclusion, but frustrating and accurate conclusion that it's both endogenous and exogenous processes that matter for these huge changes in ideology, how we think about the world and ourselves. It's not just material changes, aka in a Marxist sense, and it's not just changes of the ideas themselves in a Hegelian sense where it's just the strength of a great idea that somehow changes history. No, it's an interaction of the two. And he shows that this happens through really 3 stages. In each of these big revolutions in thought, there's really 3 stages, which is that new ideas are produced and played around with. New ideas are selected for, so in almost an evolutionary process, some of them get picked. So within the Protestant Reformation, actually within all these, there were a number of fractures and different groups arguing with each other, and some of those won out over others. So Calvinist branch wins out in the Protestant Reformation. In the Enlightenment, the more kind of reasoned anti-religious branch wins out. And in socialism, Marxism wins out. These are all kind of they were all selected for amongst all this actual ferment of activity that was happening. And then importantly, he shows for any of these to survive, they have to be institutionalized. So they have to become a part of people's lives, become a part of kind of institutions and organizations to actually have any sort of future. Let me pause there really quick, and then I'll come back with the final segment to kind of close up on some what I call big, what did I call them in the first slide? Major, I use quotes, major cultural change processes, and whether they're true or not.